Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now 2 years ago the RTX 2060 launched for £299 here in the UK, and today I bought one for just £390. There were rumours months ago that older Nvidia cards would be re-released to combat the current GPU shortages, allowing gamers to actually buy something. It seems as though this is indeed the case, as I bought this brand new card from eBuyer just a couple of days ago, and it seems as though a handful of other retailers had some in stock as well. This was the cheapest. For that price, the common sense part of my brain wants to strangle the part that controls my index finger that pressed add to basket. After all, the newer 3060 and 3060 Ti both have lower recommended retail prices at £300 and £369 respectively. On the other hand, at the time of this video, those cards are nowhere to be found, except eBay, where the cheapest ones are selling for £600 and £900 respectively. Older cards that perform similar to the 2060 like the 1070 Ti and the 1080 are also selling for over £400, and don't get me started on Vega GPUs. Somehow then, this 2060, which is more expensive now than it was on launch day in 2019, represents decent value for I can't even say it, the whole situation just leaves a sour taste. But we might as well test it. If you find one of these in stock and decide that you want one because it's probably the only thing in stock, or like any sensible person you don't want to pay for a 3060 that's selling for double RRP, then you'll want to know how well it holds up in 2021, right? So starting off we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Now what I'll do is run through some normal tests, and then at the end of the video we'll take a quick look at ray tracing in a couple of games. Here with Valhalla we were running at the high settings, and we were also seeing close to 60 FPS on average. In fact, the performance was pretty good, but there are going to be a few dips here and there, particularly in busier areas. The frame rate did drop to 40 on occasion, but the 2060 is still a fairly decent card, especially at 1080p, and I'm going to have to say that I think this is certainly a 1080p card these days. Of course, some games will run at 1440p and older titles even at 4K, but primarily for those newer games, 1080p is going to be your best bet when targeting 60 frames per second. So in Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, I decided to try and take it quite easy on the card because I didn't really know what to expect, to be honest. We didn't have any ray tracing effects on here, but we did have a mixture of medium and high settings with high anti-aliasing, as you can see from the in-game menu. Now we weren't quite reaching our VRAM limitation, we were quite a bit off to be honest, but I thought in this competitive online shooter the more frames per second the better. Now we actually saw a very nice average of well over 100 frames per second in this mall level here. Now this is footage from a bot match of course, but the figures were taken from online play, and to be honest the game will perform the same whether or not you're playing against bots or other players, but performance will vary depending on the map that you choose. So this Palit card is a single fan design. As you can see, it races towards 70 degrees and exceeds that quite quickly, sometimes getting up to around 80, but it really isn't too audible to be honest, especially considering that it is just a single fan GPU. Look at the RAM usage in Black Ops Cold War here. 16GB is definitely recommended for an ideal experience, but you should get away with 8. However, we are of course talking about the RTX 2060 here, which is doing a fine job in Call of Duty. Crysis Remastered recently received a DLSS update. However, I tend to just stick to native resolutions where I can, and I'm glad I did here even with the medium settings, because it seems as though the patch has improved performance regardless. The game was running at over 100 frames per second here. Now even at low, Crysis Remastered looks really good, but I thought we'd try and crank things up to medium just to get a little bit of extra visual quality, although I think the differences between low and medium are quite negligible. Now ray tracing effects were off again here. Personally, I don't tend to use ray tracing. Sure, the extra lighting effects and whatnot are nice, but when it comes down to it, there's still too much of a performance hit at the moment for me to consider using it. But we'll cover this a little bit more at the end. Okay, so in Cyberpunk 2077, here we go, this is the result I was dreading. I switched to the medium preset, I also set the crowd density option to medium as well, and this combines sort of low, medium and high settings from the menu once you've selected this preset. The texture quality was also set to high, and any resolution scaling options were turned off, meaning we were running at a full 1920 by 1080 and therefore seeing at least 60 frames per second on average. Now, despite what people think about the game itself, I think visually it is still quite stunning even with lower settings, and it's certainly one that pushes even modern hardware to its limits. The lighting effects look great whether or not you have ray tracing on or off, and it's definitely one of those for any keen benchmarker to include among their results, because it does give a lot of hardware a pretty hard time, though it's certainly more GPU intensive. As you can see, we're using just under 5 gigs of our available VRAM here, so I wouldn't really consider turning the settings up too much higher. So I added a new game to the benchmark roster today. This is Dirt 5. I read a few reviews about it beforehand, but it was on Game Pass, so I decided to download it. Anyway, that's one thing I really like about PC and Xbox's Game Pass. I think I pay for Ultimate, so it's about a tenner a month, and you get access to some pretty great games. I wasn't sure, as I said, how Dirt 5 would perform, so I thought I'd download it, go straight for the settings menu and then select high, where I was happy to see a comfortable plus 60 FPS average. You'll have to excuse my driving here. This was probably the second time I played it. The first time was yesterday, the tutorial level, but I think I did alright here. As you can see here, I went a little bit out of control in a minute, but the 2060 is handling this comfortably at 1080p. So with Red Dead Redemption 2, I stuck to Digital Foundry's recommended console settings. I think these are Xbox One X equivalent settings. The only difference here, instead of 4K, we are of course using 1920 by 1080. Now these settings combine a mixture of high, medium and low primarily, and of course we do have TAA enabled as well to get rid of some of those jagged edges. Now the closer to towns you get, the more the frame rate will dip, but the same can be said for going near water, trees, things like that. And when there are a lot of NPCs on screen, we also see the frame rate dip a little bit as well. For the most part though, the game's going to run absolutely fine on this card, especially with these settings, and to be honest, it still looks fantastic. This is one of those games that's going to be really visually impressive for a while to come, probably until Red Dead 3 or GTA 6 comes out, something like that. So in Watch Dogs Legion, we ran the game with the high preset and it ran absolutely fine, to be honest. There were a few dips, to be fair, below 60 frames per second. We'll get onto ray tracing in a little while, but here the game is running absolutely fine, I'd say. The CPU usage is quite high, which is something I notice quite often in this game, though it's not the limiting factor here, which is nice to see. The i5 has 6 cores and 12 threads. I think Watch Dogs Legion just isn't very well optimized, or it's just naturally CPU intensive, but for the most part, in combination with a 2060, yeah, you're going to get reasonable frame rates. You may have noticed a couple of little frame dips that occurred just now. This happens a couple of times when you first fire the game up, but things eventually smooth out after you've been playing for a minute or two. Now then, let's talk briefly about ray tracing, and we'll revisit Cyberpunk and then Watch Dogs Legion again, just to see how things change. So as I said before, I'm not a fan of ray tracing at the moment. I think it takes too much in the way of performance. Well, you can certainly notice it, let's say, in some games, but I don't think it's worth the compromise as far as performance is concerned, and Cyberpunk is a good example of that. If you want to turn all of the ray tracing settings on to actually make it, well, noticeable, then it's going to absolutely kill your frame rate with the 2060. As you can see here, we're not even getting 30 FPS, and this is with the same preset that we were using before. Nothing else has changed, but the frame rate has pretty much been cut in half, or at least half. Back in Watch Dogs Legion then, and we have just one ray tracing option. This is Reflections. Now if you turn this up to medium here under DX12, then the changes are ever so slightly noticeable, especially when you're near the River Thames. In fact, let's head over there now, and we'll switch between ray tracing and just the standard reflections mode a couple of times, just so I can show you what I mean, and then you can sort of decide for yourself whether or not you think it's worth it. So as you can see, the frame rate is a lot better than it was in Cyberpunk, but again, we are sacrificing some of the performance for what I feel really isn't that much of a change in visuals. Here's a perfect landscape actually, we've got the London Eye there, that was with ray tracing on. Let's go ahead and turn it off, and you can see just how things have changed. The reflections aren't as impressive, but again, it's not a major difference, so, and the frame rate has shot up there by at least 10 to 20 FPS, so yeah. We'll also stick ray tracing on Ultra now, just to give you an idea of how the game can look when RT reflections are at their best. And again, it doesn't really look too much different from medium, to be fair. That looks quite good under the bridge, but look at the frame rate, we are sacrificing quite a bit here. But the 2060 has been re-released in 2021. It leaves a bit of a sour taste. I mean, the price is a bit ridiculous, but all things considered, it seems to be the cheapest option at this performance point right now, unless you can find a decent deal on something used like I did with the 2060 Super the other day. It's certainly worth looking out for those second-hand options at this point in time. As for this one then, well, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.